So in the meantime, there's something in the air. And I just want to bring up this metaphor again of the something in the air, because it's not only in this big room, but it's in these small rooms as well. It might look like this, but it's actually subverting all of these assumptions. So that it's kind of an interesting thing, right, to be in this classroom, and the classroom is telling me one thing, and yet all the stuff that's going on in the air is telling me another thing about learning and what it is, what information is, what knowledge is, and so on. And it's pretty clear the way it subverts this. I mean, the first one, idea that information is scarce, that's an easy one, right? I don't really need to spend a lot of time on this, but just as a few numbers, we will collectively, as a human race, produce about 70 exabytes of information this year. That's 70 billion gigabytes that will be released into the air all around us. It's more than the entire collection of the Library of Congress. It's a lot more. It's 518,000 libraries worth of information will be produced by all of us collectively and launched into the air all around us. So this idea that information is scarce is certainly out. And there's more information floating around in the air than any one of us could ever stand to know. Now, that works out to about 12,000 gigabytes per person. That's the equivalent of a stack of books 100 meters tall. But here's where it's important. Less than 0.01% of that will be on paper. And that's important because digital information is different. Most of this information will be digital. Digital information is fundamentally different. And again, back to Marshall McLuhan, he says that we look at the present through a rearview mirror. We march backwards into the future. And I've made this little, this is a little Photoshop document thing to illustrate this. It's like we're on this information superhighway, which is a metaphor, right? A way of understanding what it is we are doing. And we look at it through the lens of another metaphor, which is a paper metaphor, a metaphor based on paper. So that you look at when you look at your screen on your laptop, you're looking at a desktop, right? This is a metaphor. It's a throwback to something we understand. And we put onto our desktop, we put folders on a desktop, the same way that we do in the physical world. It's just some way for us to grasp what's going on. It's only very recently that we've recognized that folders might not be the best way to organize digital information. It's certainly not the only way. It's a pretty good way, but there are other ways, like through tagging and things like that. And so we're only just now starting to get that digital information can be organized very differently than physical information. There's a number of reasons for that I won't get into right now. But then there's this other metaphor we use, which is the metaphor of the page. So on the web, we have these web pages, right? And so if you go back 15 years at the beginning of the web, people would actually take an article that they had written and just simply transfer it to HTML, post it on the web, and it would have no links in or out or anything like that. But they had then created a web page, and it was up on the web and so on. And so this metaphor was actually guiding practice in some way. So a bunch of people in the late 90s thought, well, we can crack through this. The web can be so much more. And so this became, this allowed DHTML to emerge. And I'm not going to get too far into this because this is really geeky territory. But for those of you who have ever done any programming, you might know what DHTML looks like. The basic thing about DHTML is that it was trying to do something else, not just to create web pages, which are mentioned here, but to bring them one step closer to its cousin, TV, in terms of special effects, which then is bringing up another metaphor, right? So it's, again, that rear view mirror. First it was looking back to print. Now it's looking back to TV. This is by the late 90s. But the problem with that was that it was really complicated to program something to look like TV on the web. And so you had to know script that looked something like this to publish something on the web. And so, of course, not very many people were producing content at this time. And Tim Berners-Lee was really upset about this. He actually mentioned that it wasn't meant to be a glorified television channel. So it's not until the early 2000s, late 1999 and then the early 2000s, that you get this blank box. And blogging was sort of the hallmark of this. And you can see here, it says blogging showed us that anybody can be a creator of information. And that's because you were suddenly confronted with this blank box. All you had to do was fill in the blank, push, publish, post, and there it goes. And if you're interested in starting a blog and you've never done it, you can do it in about 19 seconds. So I've timed myself on this. If you just go to Blogger or anything else, just sign up. 19 seconds later, you can publish to the world. So it's not surprising then that we have now 184 million blogs. It's really hard to count these things anymore. And if you are keeping track, that's almost 184 million more than there were in 2003. So you can see just how fast this is growing. And it's sort of like all of us rushing on stage, right? It's like finally, like I can have a voice. I'm going to rush out on stage, and people start blogging. And so this whole Web 2.0 universe sort of emerges from this, from just it just became so much easier for all of us to publish multiple types of content. And that meant that if you're thinking about what these walls are saying and how it confronts this idea of following along is sort of being crushed under this, because people can actually produce their own material on their own. And then Wikipedia comes along and shows us that by working together in new ways, we can actually create information that rivals the content of experts. And if you fancy yourself an expert on anything, it's pretty shocking to go onto Wikipedia and look up what you think you're an expert on and to be outdone by Wikipedia. I often find myself outdone by Wikipedia. It's pretty humbling. And Kevin Kelly has a great quote about this. He says, "Nobody is as smart as everybody." And it's obviously true. And what's interesting about this is the way that it challenges our notions of authority. So normally we talk about that you should trust authority for good information, but that's kind of being challenged by Wikipedia, obeying the authority being challenged. And it's being challenged because you have this statement here, authorized information is beyond discussion. It turns out Wikipedia is really based in discussion. And the authority of Wikipedia, for those of us who really care about the information we're getting and we want to verify it, the great thing about Wikipedia is we can go into the discussion, we actually can see the discussion behind the scenes. We can verify it by looking at the evidence that people are putting forth for their arguments and so on. So it's really actually a more transparent way of producing an encyclopedia of knowledge. And these types of discussions can now take place all over the web. And this becomes really fun for education, because one of the tools that we use in my classes is just a tool that allows you to underline anything anywhere. So you're looking at just a basic web page. This is a very Web 1.0 web page, but using some various tools. We use Digo, but you can use a lot of different tools as well. You can actually underline things on the page that your students can then see what you've underlined. You can add sticky notes to it. Students can add their own sticky notes. Conversations can emerge right on the page. So this discussion can actually happen anywhere. So this idea of authorized information being beyond discussion is being challenged there. And then ultimately you end up with this idea that learning is to acquire information being challenged quite greatly. And this idea that this is the ultimate way to assess then gets challenged, because learning, as we know, is about a lot more things. It's about the whole process. And that means it's about discussing and challenging and critiquing and sharing and ultimately creating, not just creating information, but actually creating meaningful connections. And this is where we come full circle back to that significance problem. If we can somehow center our discussion on this idea that to learn is not to acquire information, but to create significance or to create meaningful connections. And the question becomes then, not just this, how can we create meaningful connections, but also how can we create students who can create meaningful connections? This is my translation of trying to think about what it means to be a lifelong learner. It's like trying to think about how can we get students, how can we create these students who can create meaningful connections?